Welcome to season 2, episode 5 of the mixtape with Scott. Today I have a great guest who I'm excited to share with you. But before I introduce him, we got to go through the liturgy about the role of stories in our lives. I don't know why I did it in that voice. I'm excited. I love reading this part. Each week I'm going to read to you a line from a great book by Sue Johnson entitled Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love, as it can help manage expectations for you, about me, and about the podcast. We use stories to make sense of our lives, and we use stories as models to guide us in the future, and we shape stories, and then stories shape us. That is what the Mixtape with Scott podcast is about. The podcast is devoted to hearing the personal stories of economists, scientists, and authors. As you listen to these people's stories, my hope is that you hear the faint traces of your own story woven into the fabric of their life. I hope that by listening without judgment to this person's life, you feel a sense of connection to them because we are all one and we're connected. I hope that once the podcast is over, you are left with a new story that helps you and me make sense of our lives, and that you have a model to help us navigate your own life, and that I have a model in this person's story to navigate my life as I continue to update my own model. So with that, let me give a warm introduction to Dr. Paul Oyer, one of my favorite labor economists and authors in the profession. I have a fondness, as you may have noticed, for the labor economists. I like that tribe. Paul is a professor at Stanford. He's also a graduate of Princeton, which, for those who've been paying attention, has been, going back to season 1, a fascination of mine because it's sort of the birthplace of a renaissance in empirical micro under Orley Ashenfelter, David Card, and Alan Kruger, to help kind of launch this, new worldview of doing applied work. And Paul was there. And Paul is also the author of several great general interest books that I love that explain economics to normal people. That's probably a Freudian slip, but I'm not sure economists are, quote, normal people, but we do have a wonderful field. So my favorite of his is a book that explains economics. It's called Everything You Need to Know About Economics Can Be Learned from Online Dating, and I assign it every semester to my students. It's the only place you can really learn a lot of the new labor at that level. He also has a new book on sports that accomplishes much of the same thing. Thanks again to Paul for sitting down with me and letting me eavesdrop on his life as he walked me through it. I'm Scott Cunningham, the host of the Mixtape with Scott. Okay, well, it is my pleasure to have a person this week on the podcast I've kind of gotten to know a little bit from a distance and the last several years, Dr. Paul Oyer from Stanford University. Paul, thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, Scott.
Well, so for everybody listening, could you just sort of introduce yourself? I said your name, but you could say sort of where you're from, what your employer is, and sort of what you do for a living.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a labor economist here at Stanford University in the Graduate School of Business, where I mostly teach MBAs. I am also the senior associate dean overseeing the whole MBA program right now, which has been interesting during COVID. We teach management, and now the last few years I've been practicing it as well. Before that, I've been at Stanford 22 years and came here after 4 years at the Kellogg School, which was a great place to start my career. And before that, I got my PhD at Princeton.
Wow, I did not realize you were associate dean over the MBA program at Stanford. That's really what's Stanford's MBA program ranked? I know you probably know that by heart, but
actually it depends on the ranking you look at, and we are fortunate. We kind of ignore the rankings.
Oh yeah.
So
that means you're that means you're in the top 3. Only the people in the very top can ignore the rankings.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much us and Harvard.
Yeah,
and the others, there's Kellogg, Wharton. Those are great schools.
Yeah,
but in terms of if you just look at the revealed preference, nobody applies to Stanford, gets in, and turns us down to go to, say, Kellogg or Wharton.
Oh, so it's like a natural sort. There's a natural sorting into the Stanford versus like some of the others.
Yeah, Stanford and Harvard, the win rates there are different. A lot of people choose one or the other based on personal preference or geographic preference. But
Mm. Oh, okay. I'm going to end up wanting to talk to you more about that in a minute. Then, well, before we get started into your career and what you do, what your day job is like. Can you tell me where you're from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a town called Nutley, New Jersey, and
Oh, okay.
Nutley's famous for three things. It's the hometown of Martha Stewart and Robert Blake, both of whom did some jail time.
Oh, yeah.
So that
Blake allegedly killed somebody, right?
he allegedly had a contract put out on his wife, uh,
Oh,
and so he didn't do the killing, but he paid someone to do it. I don't think it was
those
even
markets don't.
successful.
Those markets seem like they should function well, but it seems like you always get people always get caught.
But well, on a related note, the third thing Nutley is known for is there are often scenes in Nutley in The Sopranos. So
Oh,
I grew up in this town that was very Sopranos-esque. I knew the Sopranos characters when I
oh,
was
that's crazy. How
yeah.
close were you to Manhattan?
About 10 miles from the Lincoln Tunnel.
Oh,
My
wow.
father was but my it was very much a working class town, but my father was a doctor and we were sort of we were I don't come from a hard scrabble background, although some of my classmates from elementary school and high school did.
Mm.
And
What?
everybody idolized Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, right. That's a great
That
person.
was the mix. The mixtape was a lot of Bruce Springsteen and stuff like that. In
Yeah,
high
yeah,
school.
right. Greetings from Asbury Park. That's my favorite one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a big club that says that. Um, so was it a small town? Was it kind of like growing up in a small town?
No, it's 30,000 people, probably 500 people in my graduating class from high school. Many, probably half of them went on to college. I'm old, so
Mm.
only about half of them went on to college. And of those, most probably just went to commuter schools, Montclair State, um, Newark College of Engineering, which is now known as New Jersey Institute of Technology, all these local sorts of schools.
Yeah.
And then I was the youngest of four, and all my sisters had gone off to other places. I went to Middlebury College in Vermont, which was quite a change from Nutley in many ways, and very it was where I learned, uh, where I really learned about academics because the high school I went to wasn't the most academically oriented in the world.
Did you like school when you were in high school?
Well, I hated my high school.
Did you really?
It was a bad. Nutley wasn't a great place to be kind of bookish. And
Ah,
so uh, I was certainly ready to get out of Nutley as soon as I could.
you liked reading or you liked your studies and stuff like that?
Yeah, I was always good at math and like every PhD economist, I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
good.
yeah.
And sure, I liked reading. I mean, I was a pretty good student and not top of the class because I was kind of a screw off in high school.
Yeah.
So
So
I,
you would say though you really were good. You would just say about like you were good at math. That was like that was what you just had you had a natural aptitude towards mathematics, and was
yeah,
that
I
what you
mean,
liked too?
yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, relative to the population, I have a very high aptitude towards math. Relative to the peer groups you and I run in, I don't have that high of an aptitude
Right,
towards math.
right, right. Yeah,
So, but
right.
in my high school and even in my college, I was an outlier in math. Then
Mm,
I don't know. I don't know if you had the same experience. I remember getting to Princeton, and then I was even an outlier in I have an MBA, very unusual for a college for a economist. I went and got an MBA because I thought I was going to work in the real world, and even there, I was sort of one of the better students math wise. And then I don't know, like that first week of grad school at Princeton, where you look around and you're like, oh, okay, I'm not at the top of the distribution
right.
anymore. There's all these people who just know so much math that I don't know either. So through some combination of having higher IQs and having already gotten master's degrees in foreign universities and things like that.
Right.
Right. Well,
I had to tell
so
that
when you
was
got to Middlebury, wait, what was that?
no, I was just going to say that that first month or two of Princeton, boy, that was humbling
Yeah.
to see all these people who were so smart.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were at Middlebury, what did you major in?
Math,
Math and computer science is what I saw, right?
math, and well, okay, but you know, if you were a college graduate in 1985, the department was called Math and Computer Science.
Oh,
So
it wasn't a double major. Oh, okay.
no, I probably took two or three computer science classes, which I was just young enough. Like the generation before me, it was punch cards. We were
Right.
sitting there with a deck mini computer. You know what, nobody even knows what that means anymore.
No.
A computer terminal that you would program in BASIC or
Oh,
Fortran.
yeah. Yeah. So you were like, what? Were you learning basic? Were you learning like Pascal or C or anything like that?
BASIC, if I remember correctly, it was BASIC, Fortran, and C.
And C.
No. C was later. Maybe that was when I was in grad school. Maybe that was when I was in my MBA program.
Yeah.
Basic, Fortran, and I don't know,
Yeah.
Global Pascal. I don't even remember.
But did you take any econ when you were at Middlebury?
A little bit, but not much. Just a few classes.
Would you take
I took
why'd you take any?
I thought I might be interested in it, and I was, but I just got going down the math track. Not sure why. I mean, I actually wrote a thesis, which, God, I mean, I can't even tell you how bad it was. So bad. It was about like regression in the stock market and something. It was like probably the most, like especially as a guy who is so focused on causal inference,
Right.
you'd really be ashamed of me. Um, and I had an advisor from economics as well as from math for that. But it's really nice about going to a liberal arts college, though, is I had an advisor and this math professor. He's a great guy. John Emerson was his name. He was a wonderful guy. I took a bunch of classes from him, and he taught. And then he became some sort of administrator, and I happened to go back through Middlebury and stop by his office. And there's nothing you can do to make a professor at a liberal arts college happier than to have been their student and just stop by and say, "Hey, how you doing? I'm a professor at Stanford now."
I cannot even fathom. What did he say? He must have been
He was
so
so happy,
delightful.
so happy. That was
Oh
nice.
man.
We're all excited when our students come by. So anyway, he was a great guy, big influence. But I think this is different now because I was in college in the '80s. Neither him nor anybody else kind of ever said maybe you should go get a PhD. I mean, it just
Mm,
maybe they know better than I do that I shouldn't. But I like it wasn't there wasn't this sort of research
right.
uh, PhD pipeline back then. Like it was
Yeah.
go work for go be a pre-doc or go apply
Right.
to a PhD program. So it never really
Hmm.
occurred to me. That's why. And the other thing is, like, you go to a liberal arts college, Swarthmore is the exception, but like I didn't know what an engineer was. I
Right.
got to my first job and I thought engineers drove trains.
Right.
And that's a little bit of something you miss by going to, like, I probably would have enjoyed taking a lot of engineering classes, but I didn't even know what that was.
Yeah. Huh. So you graduate but it's not on your mind to become an economist. What's on your mind?
So it's to be a captain of industry.
Yeah.
I went off to a consulting firm. At the time, it was a very sought after job. Unfortunately, the firm hasn't done as well lately. I went to a company called Booz Allen,
Mm,
which used to be a strategy consulting firm on top of the government consulting firm that still exists. And I mean, that was super interesting. 2 years of
mm,
like every few months you change industries. I was for a while I was the expert on a certain part of the plastic injection molded uh, outdoor furniture market, right? I mean, you become just this incredible expert in these niche little things.
right.
And that was really interesting for 2 years. And then I went back to business school. I didn't get into Stanford,
Mm,
which is ironic because I now oversee the admissions department for the MBA program.
yeah.
But they rejected me twice, and so I went off to the Yale School of Management, and I got super into the quantitative classes to the extent that we have quantitative classes in MBA program.
This was in the late 80s, early 90s.
Late 80s. Actually, I started my program in September of 1987.
Yeah.
And of course, at that point, I didn't really want to, but all my classmates were hoping, not all of them, but many of them were hoping to go to Wall Street.
Mm.
And, most people may not be old enough to know that dream evaporated about 6 weeks later, because there was the market crash in October of 1987.
Oh, yeah, right.
I eventually wrote I have this paper about the careers of investment bankers in the Journal of Finance, which I can relate to personally, because a lot of my classmates, for exogenous reasons, never entered the world of finance.
Huh. It was that disruptive. It was that disruptive that it's like literally the whole labor market, just kind of a big chunk of it got carved out.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely. So there's a graph in this paper I wrote in the Journal of Finance about this, which shows, this is for Stanford, but it would be true at Yale too. It just shows the fraction of the class that went into finance that graduated in 87 versus 88 and 89. And it drops off a cliff. And the point of the paper is, if you look 20 years later, that distinction still exists, right? So these initial conditions, for market reasons, had these big long-term effects on people that have real I don't know about on utility terms, but in dollar terms, the effects are huge, right? Because if you entered the finance world in 1987 and stayed in it for 30 years,
yeah,
versus if you entered the consumer packaged goods marketing world in 1988 and stayed there for 30 years, the difference in financial remuneration in those 30 years is like, almost an order of magnitude.
Right. Wow. Yeah. It was a permanent reshuffling of the management labor supply.
Exactly.
And because it was just so, what's the story? Why was it so out of whack?
Well, it's just, what's the story I tell in the paper I wrote is that once you get, there's something about industry specific skills or industry specific match, that not match, because it's all about, once you're there, you're stuck there, or once you're not there, you never get in. So it's shocking, like when the market picks back up, people aren't moving from consumer packaged goods back into finance.
Yeah.
They missed the boat when they graduated, and that's the end.
Yeah.
And so, the story I tell in the paper is that investment bankers are made, they're not born. Right. So it's, and then, but I went off, I was never that interested in finance, but I really got into these like production and operations management, these operations research type classes when I was at Yale. So I went off to work. So in 1989, I graduated. I went off to a high tech company called 3Com Corporation, which, is pretty much out of, I had some stock options and whatnot, and those were worth exactly $7 and over my entire career, I think, if that. And I went to work there in production, because back in the late 80s, this was 1989 when I graduated, people still made things here in Silicon Valley. So I moved out to Silicon Valley and I worked on the production floor in Santa Clara, California for this company. And we made PC boards and other sorts of things that involve production. And, my job was to plan the production line and to, do things like that. And for a while, I was kind of applying these techniques we'd learned in our MBA program, but it just wasn't that exciting. I mean, the real world, I quickly decided the real world was boring in relative to, like, I always, I mean, this won't, like everybody who goes on to become an economist, I liked playing with numbers. I liked spreadsheets, things like that. And, the job was just kind of meetings and whatever, which is ironically what I do now. But
you thought maybe you would go on to become like a path to CEO or something like that, but you learned kind of quickly you learned something about yourself or something about the job.
Yeah, I learned something about myself. I didn't see I didn't at the time have a lot of interest in climbing the corporate ladder, and I wanted to sit around. I didn't know it existed yet, but I wanted to program in Stata. I didn't know that's what I wanted to do, but that's what I wanted to do. And somehow I figured out this whole idea of becoming an economist. And I called up Sharon Oster. I don't know if Sharon, Emily's mother, who was, I had taken several classes from during my MBA program. And I called her up and said, I was thinking of becoming an economist. And she's the one who said, well, and for reasons I can't even remember the reasons for this. I wanted to be a labor economist. Like if you ask, I wrote my essay in 1992 to go to graduate school. And like the 1-page thing on what I wanted to do was what I ended up doing. Like I said, I want to study personnel economics. I didn't say those words because I didn't know they existed. And I said, I want to study labor market problems and how firms solve these problems and things like that. Why I was interested in that, I have no idea.
Was Lazier already doing work on that? Was that in your head at all?
Lazier was doing, but I didn't know anything about Lazier because I called Sharon Oster and she said, and I described what I want to do. And she said, you should apply to Princeton because Princeton's good at labor economics. Right. And I was like, all right, I'll apply to Princeton. And, maybe she mentioned Orley's name. And like, so I applied to Princeton. And this is a great, this is where I had the most luck that I know of in my whole life. I applied to Princeton and, I'd been out of undergrad for 7 years. So I send my application in and, my test scores are fine, my GPA, all that. So that's not going to hold me back, but it's not going to get me in, the people applying to Princeton, but, it put me in the running. And my file got assigned, I was told this years later, my file got assigned to a member of the faculty who was on the admissions committee, and he said, this guy has an MBA, he's been working, he's not going to really be serious about this, let's reject him. And the administrative person in charge of the administrative person who sends out the rejection letters or whatever from the PhD office at Princeton's economics department, she apparently reads my file and says, well, he says in his essay he wants to do labor economics. So let's send it over to the industrial relations guys. So they sent my file to Hank Farber and David Card, and they're like, let this guy in. If she hadn't sent it over there, I would have been rejected. I probably wouldn't have gone to grad school.
Wow.
I wouldn't have bothered. The other place I got in, I didn't get funding. I probably wouldn't have left my career to go back to grad school if it hadn't been for this. I got into Princeton. They gave me the IR section fellowship, which was the biggest one in Princeton. So
what does that mean? I don't, I know that in the history of design based causal inference, it's really the story is of Princeton's industrial relations section, as it seems like with Orley and Card and Kruger and all the students and everybody. But I don't really understand, what is the industrial relations section? It's like it's like the Hoover Institute, or it's like an endowment or something.
Yeah, it does have its separate endowment. So Princeton has a lot of little centers, I guess section, I don't know what, we would probably call it a center here at Stanford. And they have a lot of little centers. There's one for development economics that was Angus and Deaton and Ann Case when I was there, and there's other people now. There's all these, there's one for finance that wasn't there when I was there, but it's become a big deal. But I think the first one of these of any real meaning was the industrial relations section, which was financed by, there's a book out, they've sent a book out. I think I have it on my it's not, I thought it was on my coffee table, but it's not. Anyway, and Al Reese was there and all these other people, and then Orley came through, and they just had the biggest endowment of anything like it. So we were very well funded even back in the 90s. Not by modern standards, we were terribly funded, of course,
right?
But by standards at the time, I would have plenty of money to work as an RA every summer for Hank Farber, and if he didn't have anything for me to do, I would get paid as an RA to work on my thesis.
Right. Right.
And yeah, and it was Orly. When I was there, it was Orly, David, Alan Kruger, David Card, Orly Eschenfelder, Alan Kruger, and my main advisor was Hank Farber, and my secondary advisor was David. And I mean, the students there, I mean, the other students that you would, have as peers were also incredible. So, I was in, I, the, well, guy named Kevin Halleck, who's now a university president, was a close contemporary of mine.
Katie Grady, would she have been in there with you, or she's
She's a
not?
couple of years ahead of me, so I didn't know her very well.
Oh, okay.
I met her, I certainly knew her, but we weren't
Right.
close.
Yeah.
And uh, Ken Che, who's was
Oh, really?
kind of
Ken Che was there. Okay.
Ken was he was the real star of things.
Oh, wow.
He was incredibly. God, that guy is sharp.
Yeah.
So and then a bunch of others over the years. I mean, that I was there, and it was great. And I spent. So the thing was, I had some interest in theory. In fact, one of my chapters of my thesis was a theoretical paper. But I got very lucky because a guy named Alan Manning from LSE came to
Yeah.
visit.
Mm-hmm.
And Alan helped me a lot. And then on top of that, Hank was a very good friend and co-author of Bob Gibbons. And at some point, Hank hooked me up with Bob, who both helped me with some of my papers and probably more importantly, wrote me a letter on the job market and knew which people at which business schools would find what I did interesting. And there was Eddie, of course, but I didn't get a job at Stanford, who was interested. I'd met Eddie through giving a seminar, and he was wonderfully helpful to me on the job market, but they didn't have a job at Stanford that year. And then a few years later, Eddie was still interested in what I was doing, and this job, well, that's another story of where, the amount of luck that has struck me to land me in this position is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's sort of if you had to guess, what was the value added or the treatment effect of Princeton's, at that time for you in your personal life? How are you different?
Oh, you mean relative to if I'd gone to another school?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Or even somewhere else within Princeton, if you hadn't have been in the industrial relations section.
I think it was high, but not like, I mean, obviously there were students at that same time who went off to Harvard and worked with, that was pre-Josh Angress. I'm trying to think who it would have been. But anyway, there were other good places to become a good labor economist. I think maybe Princeton was the best, but there were other places. So it's hard to say.
Would you have said, like we think about causal inference and like, natural experiments and instruments and, like explicit counterfactuals and all that stuff. Like it's like a coherent thing, but like, did you sense when you were there that it was like you were getting a slightly different take on empirical ways of doing analysis than you would have gotten at like Harvard or anywhere else? Did you feel like there was something unusual about of course you don't really know, but is it now looking back?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think maybe with a couple of exceptions, Harvard being one of them, I think I did. I mean, you would go into seminars I started going to the labor seminar the week I arrived because they'd given me their fellowship, and I figured I might as well learn as much as I can. So even though I was still like treading water in core microeconomics class, I would still go to the seminar just to see what was going on. And of course, two things were different there than some other places. And one is exactly what you're saying, the focus on causal things. But then the other thing is Princeton back then was a pretty theoretical place. And I think there was nothing really going on structurally. There was no structural work going on either, at Princeton or among the people that they were working with. And so there was a real focus on empirical methods. I mean, Hank Farber used to say at the beginning of like within 5 minutes of every seminar, okay, what are we regressing on what?
Right.
Right. So
Right.
that was that was that was a real distinction relative to some, because at the time a lot of the world was in the early 90s, a lot of the world was focused still on game theory.
Yeah. Right. Because you mentioned Bob Gibbons. He's got that applied game theory book, right? That
Yep.
it's kind of like
Yep.
yeah. So you were kind of sorting a little bit into micro, like not necessarily, I mean, like you were doing theory, you were kind of interested in economic theory, but you're this full blown modern labor economist too, with all this empirical work.
Yeah, but I mean, I do very lowbrow theory.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Right.
It's like, very, very, I mean, and I don't say that to, like, I don't even think of that as a negative thing. There's not enough lowbrow theory anymore. I mean, Eddie Lazier, who's my favorite economist ever, made his career, like the impact he had on the profession doing lowbrow. He did a little higher brow than me, but lowish brow theory is amazing, because if you doesn't matter the it's really about the insight in my mind, not the technique.
Right.
I have
Right.
I have a lot of colleagues in the profession and even on this hall at Stanford who might disagree with that, but
Yeah. What's so special about him to you? About Eddie Lazier?
oh, Eddie, he's the most natural, and he was the most natural economist you've ever met in your life. I mean, I used to joke that he won some award, and what I said about him that night was, I'm pretty sure on the day he was born, he weighed the costs and benefits of leaving his mother's womb. Right? So, I mean, he saw the heart of every economic. I mean, like, he just saw the economics of every problem so naturally and so immediately, and just And the other thing was, like, you can go to seminars and I'd be like bored out of my mind, not paying any attention. And Eddie could, I mean, like, he loved it so much. He would still be asking the most, penetrating and interesting questions of anybody. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing that was great is that then translated into, he wrote these papers that were so simple. Like, you'd read the abstract and I was like, well, I don't need to read the paper. I got the point. And it's like,
Right.
why didn't I think of that 10 years ago and write that model down?
Mm.
So and then on top of everything else, on top of the research, I mean, Eddie was just like he was a true mensch, right? This was a guy who gave more in terms of public service to the profession than anybody. And as I often say about him, it's very ironic because he was also the most hardcore, rational, homo economicus believer. He was not a friend of behavioral economics, shall we say. And yet he was despite that, he was like one of the great providers of public goods in the profession, despite the fact that he would never model somebody acting in the way.
Right. I think you're, I think that you've managed that's actually, I see in your book, the everything of course, I'm the biggest fan of that book that's ever lived. I really think that book, it's unreal. It is unbelievable. I really think it's like the thing about that book, everything I want to know about economics I learned from online data. I have several. I give it away. And the thing is that I don't think a lot of people know is, like, there's like, a genre of economics, which is the book I'm going to assign in principles that won't be the textbook, but I'm going to assign it to genre. And it's like Ken Elzinga's Fatal Equilibrium, which is a detective story of a guy that uses economics to solve, crimes. Russ Roberts' Invisible Heart, which is a romance novel. But then there's like Stephen Landsberg's Armchair Economist, Paul Krugman's Accidental Theorist. Even Freakonomics kind of fits that, but those four kind of are more of where I see your book, the books that you write, which is like this whole it's like you explaining how economics is so broadly applicable to all of life. And and so to do it, to pull it off is just like a feat, because you have to like somehow make all of this economics sell at this really attractive level without it feeling like a gimmick. And everything I want to know about economics I learned from online dating, it's really unbelievable because it's like all of modern labor, in there. It's like search, signaling, cheap talk, two-sided matching, returns to skill and education, beauty, discrimination. You wouldn't think that it's like it's kind of what you just said actually about was when I have when I read that book, your book, I just thought I was supposed to write this book. I was supposed to be the one to write this book. I'm the one that's interested in two-sided matching and room and like partnerships and stuff. And you did, and it's just absolutely brilliant. It's just a brilliant, and it's so well written. I really think it's a fantastic book.
Thank you. That is very kind.
I mean, so when did you start having now you've written a new one, An Economist Goes to the Game, and I want to hear about it, hear about it. But when did you start having these books inside you? When did you notice there were these books inside you?
Well, these books inside me, that's a really interesting way of putting it. And by the way, this last one, the sports book, I mean, it just took so long to get it to where I wanted it. So the dating book is like very quick. It just came right out. And maybe that's because the process of dating didn't last that long. I was lucky. I found my wife after a year or so.
Yeah.
Whereas the sports thing has been a long time, a lifelong thing. I think I was just ready, to find new challenges. And I'm, I get a lot of grief for the book, especially the dating book.
The online dating book, you get grief from it?
Yeah, serious economists think, well, why are you writing instead of writing a paper for Econometrica? And and my view is, I mean, more power to everybody who's only spending their time writing papers for Econometrica. That's great. But like, what writing papers for Econometrica doesn't make us useful.
Mm-hmm.
Helping what people write in Econometrica, helping that influence the way people think and learn. That's where things are useful.
Yeah.
And you could do that in a policy way or something like that. And I just did it more. I've always been like, okay, well, let me see how I can help some people see the value of what we're doing.
Totally.
And I didn't, the book the dating book just kind of arose out of nowhere. I went on my very first date and I wrote an email that night to a good friend of mine explaining what had happened.
Yeah.
And she wrote back and she said, "Oh, you should write a book about this." And I was like, nah, but then, I don't know, maybe that is what really got the idea going in my mind. And then, but if you go out and start online dating and you're a labor economist,
yeah.
I mean, it just really is. It is like, it's the idea of doing this in a dating context it's a bit gimmicky, but like, it's not that gimmicky.
Oh, that's the thing is, and I guess like, this is probably because I study these, technology matching sexual markets and stuff, but it's not gimmicky at all. It's completely the right way to think. I mean, in my opinion, it's like literally the way to understand what these platforms are doing. I think what's really kind of interesting, that's why I always kind of think is so neat about it is, when you teach principles of micro, which you probably don't teach that class, but like when you teach principles of micro, you do teach it. Well, it's like you don't get into necessarily all this rich stuff because not all the textbooks have things like heterogeneous. They don't have a lot of heterogeneous stuff, and so, because, it just takes so much time to build to it. And it's like, I always kind of wonder how, in 100 years, how are we going to be doing this? Because everything interesting is growing at the extensive margins. And like, I don't know how you ever can get to this because of how long it takes to cover production functions and cost functions and stuff. And so, well, it's like, this is the only way. Your book is like the only way I know how to tell students about this book, and Al Roth's who gets what, is a way to talk to people about modern markets have a tremendous amount of matching. Yeah. They have a tremendous amount of search. It's, modern markets prices are very complicated, even concepts, that are functioning in ways that, well, sometimes they're not there. And then sometimes they're, that isn't exactly it. And, you do such a great job of walking people through so much advanced material that's not ordinarily accessible. Tell me about the new book. I mean, so what's new about this new book?
Well, the new book started out when my son was he still in high school? He was in college, I guess. My son was in college, and he's a big sports fan, and we always did a lot of sports stuff together. And I don't know, and he was an English major, so he's a really good writer. And we just started talking about, well, maybe I could do what I've done in the dating context, in the sports context, with his help. And it'd be kind of like our story of sports together. And it didn't quite work out exactly along those lines for two reasons. One, he got older. By the time we got this done, he was older and had his own life as a lawyer, and and he's basically a communist who doesn't believe in markets anyway. So that became a little bit of an impediment too. And the other thing is like some of the, let's tell our story. That's interesting in a couple of contexts within the book, but like, I'm not, nobody wants to read Paul Oyer's memoir, right? I'm not. Right. So the book actually starts with my son hitting a home run in his little league game, and there's a couple of other little vignettes from our own lives. Like I explained mixed strategy through when he and I used to play ping pong, right? Because as you know, ping pong is basically just one big mixed strategy game. But then it kind of diverged, and I started writing he helped do some of the research on this. And I just started thinking about, well, what are topics in sports that where economics is really important? And of course, there's many of them. And I got hooked up with this guy at Yale. You published your book at Yale, but I think you had a different editor. My editor's name was Bill Frucht, and he was really interested in this and incredibly patient with me, as the book has ended up taking quite a bit of time. But yeah, I mean, there were a couple. I think, again, it's a little different from the dating book in that it's not all labor economics. Right. So like the second chapter is about is about comparative advantage and natural advantage, and it's why are some countries so good at certain sports. And the first chapter, I guess it's kind of labor economics. It's about youth sports and whether you should invest in your kid's sporting career. But that's those, and those places are probably some of the most surprising things in the book. Like if you look, there's a discussion in the part about youth sports about how, I take people through the fact that everybody says, oh, you should play sports because you learn teamwork and you learn this and discipline and that. And if you look in the data, there's just nothing to back that up. I mean, as a causal inference guy, you'd love it, right? The correlation between youth sports participation and future income is high.
Right.
The evidence that there's a causal link is
pretty slim.
Yeah. I mean, like that's you were incredibly generous there when you said it's pretty slim. And so, it looks like, so the conclusion is for most of us who are sort of middle class, for people who are middle class or upper middle class, you probably don't want to invest in your kid's sports career for investment purposes. You want to do it as a consumption good because, youth is the most, economics is the study of scarce resources, and our scarcest resource we have of all is our youth, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So sure, play sports because it's fun and because you're going to have these memories, but not because you're going to even, and maybe you get a college scholarship, but even the numbers there are very
Right.
not very close. But the counter example to that I give is Kevin Durant. So Kevin Durant was 6'8" and 6'8" when he was 13 and incredibly athletic. And if you look at like the demographics of someone from Kevin Durant's background, very humble background, African American guy, single mother from the city. If you just look at kind of like, you take the Raj Chetty type look at this and you say, well, what are his chances in the regular labor market of moving up in the world? They're not that good. But when you're 6'8" and you're athletic,
yeah,
the fraction of people with that background who can then go on to be star athletes is high. Right? You can make it in the NBA if you're already 6'8" and athletic when you're 13.
Yeah.
And so as a result, the best estimate I have is that there are 300,000 African American men, 320,000 African American men in the United States right now who were born in 1988.
Okay.
And of those 320,000 people, Kevin Durant makes 1% of the total income of that group, right? And NFL and NBA players make like 6 to 7% of the number for a group of 300,000 people. So, the labor market prospects just weren't that are not that promising.
Right.
And, some of kind of rolling the dice made a lot of sense for people, at least if you're already 6'8".
You need to know but you can tell with your family.
Yeah, you
to some degree.
To some degree, but not, the other example I give in the book, which is somebody who it paid off just as well, but it wasn't as obvious a good bet at the time, is Russell Westbrook.
Yeah.
So this guy is incredibly talented when he's 13 or 14, but he's not that tall. And like for every Russell Westbrook, there's 100 or 1,000 guys who put in all that effort and are now, not making any money playing basketball.
Right.
But for every Kevin Durant who's 6'8", there's maybe only one or two others who put in that effort and it's not paying off.
Well, let me ask you something. So, this whole being able to image and likeness, policy change with the NCAA. I'm just curious, what do you think is how is the marginal athlete being affected by that along all the margins you've thought about the ability to profit as a student?
Yeah, not very like that. The name, image, and likeness stuff is great. Don't get me wrong, right? There's markets. Like, let's let people capture their value in the market, and let's not exploit workers, college athletes, a class of workers.
Right.
So I'm all for it, but it's not having a big effect beyond. I mean, if you look at college athletes, very few of them bring in real revenue in a way that is going to change that anybody's going to pay them a lot to be associated with them. The other, but it is a nice trend. By the way, the other trend that I just love is, as labor economists, we should all love, is the portal, right? So about the portal where where the NCAA players in basketball, football, and other sports can now transfer schools much more easily.
Yeah, right.
So, so not only did we have indentured servitude in the NCAA where, you were working for free. Well, you get a scholarship. I mean, there's some value, but you're working for free. We're certainly well below marginal product of labor for many of the top players. Now, at least you can, take your efforts to the place where, even if you're not going to get a direct financial return, you can move to wherever you're going to get the best individual return in whatever way.
Do you think that was economists that were helping involved with that? You think about, like, in economics, well-defined property rights involve transferability, exclusivity, and enforceability with like pollution. So it's like, but it doesn't seem like the goal ever of the NCAA was like, make sure these labor inputs are, getting priced correctly. I mean, it's like, but like, did economists have any involvement in any of that at all?
I don't know. It's a good question. I actually don't even know how it
Yeah.
got to be.
Yeah.
I mean, Ed, how did the portal come to be? I mean, I know how the name, image, and likeness stuff came about, right? There was a Supreme Court case, and then various states started changing things. But I don't honestly know how much economists were involved.
Mm.
There must have been economists involved in some of the court cases. I'm sure there were expert witnesses in the Ed O'Bannon or whoever it was cases that opened some of this up, and that's got to go way back. Like, I don't know how much you know about the reserve clause in baseball, right? But in the old days, baseball players also made a lot less than probably their marginal product of labor because they had two choices: play for the team that signed them in the draft, or do something other than playing baseball.
Mm.
And when they were allowed to start being free agents as a result of kind of indirectly this case involving Kurt Flood and then some negotiations afterwards, there must have been economists who were expert witnesses and influencing those cases. But I don't actually know I've not heard the of that direct input. There was, I mean, I do know economists were writing about this. So
Yeah.
the field of sports economics is not that well known within economics, but a couple of people are real giants who wrote about the reserve clause. Gerald Scully, who I believe is somewhere in Texas. Yeah, he's somewhere in Texas, so you may see him at a conference now and then. Guy named Simon, was it Rottenberg? Oh, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. The father of sports economics, who wrote this paper about the reserve clause back in the 50s. So economists have been studying this a long time. I'm not sure to what degree we affected the actual outcomes of any of this. I'm sure we did, but not in a public way.
Right. Well, I know it's top of the hour, and I love talking to you. I have one thing I want to end with. On TikTok, there was a theme that went around where they would say, "What's something that lives rent free in your head?" And then people would play funny clips of scenes from movies that like they sort of said lived rent free, meaning you gladly let those memories stick around. So what's a paper in economics, now that you're an old man and you've been around the block for a long time, what's a paper that you've noticed has lived rent free in your head for a while?
Wait, let me make sure I get the premise of the question. Like, what's a paper that I just think about and has an influence in the way
it's not a paper that you would say, well, this is my favorite paper or this is the best paper. It's a paper that you just have noticed over the years that it's one of the handful of papers that you just kind of remember a lot or you think about a lot.
Such a good question. So there's a bunch by Eddie that I would point to, that I'm always thinking about, like as a simple example, the one about skill weights in firm specific human capital, which is like one of those ideas where if you hear it, you're like, you see it everywhere. But I'll tell you two others that come to mind. One's an obvious one. Have you gone back and read this Spence signaling paper anytime recently?
No, I haven't reread it in a while. No.
I mean, that's such a great paper and such an insight. Right?
Yeah, totally.
But I'll throw one out off the wall that
is a great one. That one is one that I think about all the time. I think about signaling all the time.
There's a paper I think is incredibly underappreciated that I see in real life quite a bit, and that's Canis Prendergast's paper on the careers of bureaucrats that was in the AAR maybe 20 years ago now.
Oh.
And basically, this is in a world where it was about in a world, it's a simple Eddie simple model. There's not, the technique is not the contribution. The idea is the contribution. But basically, I won't do a great job of marketing this paper for poor Canis, but I'll try. If you're in a world where you can't pay people necessarily, or well, you can, where it's hard to line up incentives, like a bureaucracy is the example he often gives, where you can't use pay for performance. You want to hire people based on their preferences. And it just depends on the situation you're in exactly how you do that. So in the way he lines this up, this explains why why you want doctors who are sympathetic or not with their patients. You want social workers who really care about the people they're working for. And then you also want, and then the logic behind this, which, it's probably probably would be, if I state this wrong, I'll get canceled. So I should be careful. But basically, if you take this model seriously, it sort of gets at why you would want police who are not necessarily, who have biased views against criminals,
right?
Or potential criminals, or you'd want customer service agents who are jerks.
Wait, so what's the problem if you're not like that? Let's say you were to try to do pay for service and you did not have people whose preferences were all entangled in the service. What exactly is the problem?
So if you can't do the pay, if you can't get the pay right, you want to align people whose preferences are in line with the outcome you need in the end, right? And then anyway, he wrote a bunch of papers that should have been revisited during the George Floyd stuff, because he then looked at this empirically in police settings and talked about how these types of ideas affected the behavior of policemen and so police officers and the like.
Wow, yeah. So you've got to somehow, but then that means you've got to get ex ante. The firm needs to get ex ante reasonable signals of preferences,
or make the job attractive in a way that people
or allow them to right. You've got to either, if you've got this job, but that's the problem, is if it's got to be attractive to those who have those preferences and not attractive. I mean, in some ways I could imagine lower compensation almost being part of the design, because you've got people that are getting compensating differentials from the work itself.
That's exactly part of the insight.
Oh, that's fascinating. The career of bureaucrats.
I can't remember the name of the paper.
I'll find it. Okay. I'll follow up with you. That's great. Well, it's so nice to see you and talk with you.
It's Canis Prendergast at the university.
There's no way I'm going to be able to know how to spell that. I'll ask you afterwards. Okay. Well, it's really nice to chat with you. And I'm excited about this new book being out, and I'm going to get to assign it. And next, it's going to be hard for me to ever not assign the online dating book, though. So I have to, but I'm a grown up. I can work through that.
I appreciate that. That's very kind of you, Scott.
All right. You have a great day.
Thanks very much.